The very first time I purchased an item entirely for myself, independent of my husband's permission, it was a winter coat. My age was 24. It happened during the second week of November, right when the autumn wind blowing across the acreage behind our property carried that distinct, piercing chill native to Holmes County. It is the kind of cold that effortlessly discovers the exposed skin between a woman's shawl and her neck, settling there stubbornly. I recall lingering by the kitchen window for nearly an hour, watching the final remaining brown leaves detach from the maple tree situated near the woodshed. My mind was entirely occupied by the thought of a particular garment displayed at the local dry goods establishment in town. It was navy wool, completely modest, and lacked any buttons that might be deemed worldly by the community. Any Amish woman could have worn it without eliciting a single judging glance during Sunday service. To afford it, I had quietly accumulated my personal egg-selling earnings over a span of 2 consecutive years, keeping exactly $17.40 tucked safely inside an old coffee canister hidden behind row after row of preserved jars in the basement. My existing winter attire was torn beneath the arm, an injury I had personally stitched together on 4 separate occasions, and its inner fabric layer had entirely failed to provide warmth since the previous winter. Rather than approaching Jonas about the matter, I simply journeyed into town alongside my sister-in-law on a Thursday afternoon, bought the garment, brought it home wrapped neatly in brown paper, and suspended it from the wooden peg resting beside the rear entrance. That single act marked the dawn of everything, though I possessed no awareness of it at the time. I spent my entire upbringing within this community, residing on the very same plot of land that my grandfather originally cleared, working in the identical kitchen where my mother instructed me to shape pie dough using the base of my palm. My marriage took place when I was 19, and my departure occurred at 26. This is a narrative I have kept close for a very long duration, holding these memories tight during the years I wore the traditional prayer cap. If these reflections resonate with your own life, passing this account along to other women who might find comfort in it helps ensure these experiences reach those who need them most. I invite you to share your own experiences below. Have you ever made a small purchase entirely for yourself, perhaps a minor item like a coat, a book, or a simple beverage in an unfamiliar town where your identity was entirely anonymous, only to be overwhelmed by a profound sense of wrongdoing afterward? Please share your path, as I deeply value and read each account. To truly understand what happened, it helps to examine what that purchase actually represented. In the mainstream world, buying apparel is an ordinary transaction. Within the boundaries of my upbringing, a woman possesses absolute ownership over nothing at all. Her role is to utilize objects, maintain property, and relocate items from one living space to another. But genuine possession is entirely absent. Furthermore, making an independent choice is forbidden, because the act of choosing is viewed as an expression of personal vanity. We use the term hokmut to describe this pride, and it was considered the most perilous spiritual failing a female could exhibit. A man was permitted a sense of satisfaction regarding the yield of his agricultural acreage, but a woman harboring self-importance about any material possession, even a simple winter coat, was viewed as having initiated a gradual, perilous estrangement from God. The unwritten code governing our daily existence was known as the Ordnung. It was never recorded in a manual or listed on paper. Rather, it functioned as the very atmosphere permeating every room. It manifested in the specific, heavy gaze your mother would direct at you if your hand drifted toward an inappropriate shade of cloth at the fabric shop. It was present in the absolute quiet gripping the dinner table whenever your father made a definitive choice concerning your life without your prior knowledge. It occupied the unspoken intervals between conversations, and it sustained the entire social structure. If you compromised that foundation, the structural integrity of the entire household would fail. The hierarchy of governance was absolute and instilled in me long before I was old enough to weave my own hair into braids. The chain began with God, descended to the bishop, moved to your father until your wedding day, and then transferred to your husband for the remainder of your life, leaving you and eventually your children at the bottom. A wife is expected to yield, while a husband is meant to govern. These specific scriptural admonitions were recited at every marriage ceremony, including my own, reminding wives to submit to their spouses as they would to the Lord. By the time Jonas and I knelt together before our spiritual leader, those phrases had been repeated so frequently that they ceased to register as mere words. They had transformed into the background architecture of my existence, as familiar as the chair beneath me or the floorboards under my feet. The nature of a floor, of course, is that you remain entirely oblivious to its presence until it begins to collapse beneath you. I must emphasize that Jonas was fundamentally a decent man before continuing, because the events I am recounting could easily paint the portrait of a malicious spouse. He was not a malicious person. Jonas was simply an individual who had been assigned a rigid behavioral script at 8 years old, and he had never encountered a single soul who suggested that such a script could be re-evaluated. As the second male child born to a dairy farmer residing 2 church districts away, our first introduction occurred at a youth singing during the autumn of my 18th year. He possessed a gentle, understated laugh, and hands already hardened by labor far beyond his youth. When the event concluded, he accompanied me out to the horse-drawn carriages, his skin flushing a deep crimson as he requested the privilege of escorting me home. Our wedding took place the following November on a Tuesday, attended by 300 community members and featuring 4 hours of rigorous scriptural preaching, followed by a meal of roasted poultry, creamed celery, and 7 varieties of baked pies arranged to cool on long benches situated behind the house. My mother spent the hours before sunrise plaiting my hair, and my grandmother presented me with her personal devotional text, containing a dried forget-me-not blossom preserved between its pages. By the subsequent September, our family expanded with the birth of a son whom we named Eli. In a conventional narrative, this would be the moment designated as joyful, and in various respects, it truly was. Jonas was a dependable provider who consistently gathered the firewood, led our household prayers at mealtime, and cradled our infant son with the hesitant, rigid care of a man terrified that a breath drawn too close might shatter a fragile child. The affection I felt for him did not mirror the passionate romances described in the forbidden English library books I occasionally sneaked, but I had been thoroughly conditioned to view those secular stories as fabrication. I believed that the bond we were forging, rooted in cooperative labor, a unified spiritual devotion, and a shared shelter against the elements, constituted the only authentic form of love that existed. For 5 years, I very nearly convinced myself of that truth. Then, I bought the coat. Jonas returned from his chores in the barn that evening at his precise, customary hour. He removed his headwear, suspending it from the wooden peg situated directly above my new purchase. He observed the garment intently, but offered no verbal comment. Taking his seat at the table, he ate the evening meal I served him, a pastry dish utilizing a chicken I had processed that morning, accompanied by applesauce prepared during our September canning cycle. Throughout the meal, he ate, offered his silent prayers, and eventually retired to bed, remaining completely mute toward me for 4 consecutive days. It requires great care to articulate exactly what that experience feels like from the inside. To someone who has never inhabited a home where absolute silence is deployed as a punitive measure, it might appear inconsequential. A person might assume that because no physical violence occurred, the situation was manageable, and that assumption is accurate in only one sense. He never raised a hand against me, as physical battery is counter to our principles. What we practice instead is far more agonizing. On the initial morning, I rationalized that he was merely exhausted. By the second day, I persuaded myself that his mind was occupied by concerns regarding the southern grazing fields. On the 3rd morning, however, Eli glanced up from his small dining chair and inquired why his father was upset, making it clear that even a child of 4 could perceive the rapid drop in our home's emotional temperature. By the 4th day, my hands trembled as I prepared his morning coffee, because a human body subjected to prolonged stress recognizes an underlying threat long before the conscious mind formulates the thought. I found myself anticipating his wrath, wishing for a verbal dispute, or craving any tangible reaction whatsoever, but I received nothing at all. That was the juncture at which my mother made an unexpected appearance. Her visits never occurred on Thursdays. She traditionally arrived on Saturdays, bearing a basket of freshly baked bread, a container of pickled chow-chow, and news gathered from around our church district. Consequently, when I observed her navigating the driveway on a Thursday morning, completely empty-handed and moving slowly against a biting headwind, I understood her purpose before she even stepped onto the veranda. She declined to shed her outerwear, choosing instead to sit at the kitchen table with her fingers intertwined, her gaze shifting from the suspended coat to my face, and then down toward her own hands. She remarked that a wife who permits the cold to enter her household possesses no right to object when the entire structure freezes over. That single statement constituted her entire commentary on the matter. She consumed a solitary mug of coffee, inquired briefly about the status of Eli's lingering cough, left an unsolicited loaf of bread resting on the kitchen counter, and retraced her steps down the driveway. Watching her departure from the window, the full weight of her message became transparent. Jonas had carried his grievance to his mother, who in turn communicated with mine, resulting in my mother being dispatched as an emissary. The garment had ceased to be mere clothing. It had become a structural fracture within the harmony of our entire district. The community was now organizing its social defenses, operating much like a biological body, closing ranks around an injury to contain me and enforce compliance. Our next visitor was Susanna, Jonas's sister, who arrived on a Monday under the pretext of seeking my perspective on a fabric patch intended for a quilt. She remained at my table for 3/4 of an hour without uttering a single direct word about the coat. Instead, she spoke at length about how fortunate certain women were to possess spouses who exhibited tolerance toward willful behavior. She recounted an incident where her own husband observed that a woman incapable of finding contentment in what was provided had discarded the true significance of her matrimonial commitments. She maintained a consistent smile throughout the conversation, consumed 2 mugs of coffee, and took her leave. Following her, the bishop's wife made an unannounced appearance on a Wednesday afternoon. Her stay was brief, during which she complimented the hanging garment, noting its attractive color and expressing her hope that I had managed to find internal peace regarding the unapproved manner in which it was obtained. She placed a container of baked goods on the counter and departed before I had even finished pouring her a hot beverage. The entire community possessed full knowledge of the situation, yet no one addressed it explicitly. This indirect communication is the exact method by which Amish women convey serious warnings. 3 distinct women had arrived within a span of 8 days, none of them naming the actual transgression, but all circling the issue like birds hovering over an open field. By the middle of December, Jonas resumed verbal communication with me, though his tone mirrored that used when managing a horse that has previously bolted and remains unpredictable. He spoke cautiously, utilizing an entirely flat inflection while constantly monitoring my expressions. He never made a direct reference to the purchase because he had no functional need to do so. The coat remained suspended from its peg like an unspoken casualty in an avoided room. I simply persisted in wearing my previous outerwear. The definitive turning point materialized during a communal quilting gathering held the week preceding Christmas. An elder woman named Rebecca, who was 68 years old and had outlived 2 spouses as well as 7 of her own siblings, was present. She belonged to that class of women whose hands remain perpetually industrious, even during moments of physical rest. She had threaded sewing needles for me when I was a child of 8, long before my own vision was acute enough to master the task. On that afternoon, she was positioned directly across the quilting frame from me, while a group of women shared a laugh at the opposite end of the structure. Rebecca inclined herself forward slightly, never breaking her stitching rhythm, and uttered in a hushed tone that the garment itself was not the real issue. As she pulled her thread through the fabric without looking up, she noted that while physical violence is absent from our customs, the alternative method employed is significantly more severe. They systematically extract all emotional warmth from an environment, then simply observe how long a person can endure the resulting isolation. She observed that the majority of women eventually condition themselves to stop seeking independent paths, tying off her thread while keeping her gaze fixed on her work. She told me I was neither the first nor the last person to experience this internal awakening, but noted that I was among the rare individuals who had actually reached out for something different. With that, she exited the space to replenish her beverage and never returned to my section of the quilting frame for the remainder of the event. I continued my needlework for 2 additional hours in a state of numbness, completely unable to recall the design or pattern I worked on. The only thing that remained was the memory of her observations, settling heavily within my core like a smooth stone carried in an apron pocket, the sort of weight you endure for so long that your skeletal frame eventually shifts its posture just to accommodate the burden. The official visitation from our spiritual leader occurred that January. It was customary for bishops to conduct these meetings on weekday afternoons within a comfortable, heated sitting room, usually with hot beverages prepared and baked goods cooling nearby. Our bishop sat in the front parlor, a formal space reserved strictly for twice-yearly funeral viewings or significant encounters of this nature. He never once elevated his vocal volume. The defining characteristic of Bishop Mast was his ability to convert mildness into an instrument of authority, creating an impression of administering aid to an injury, even as he deepened the cut. He indicated that reports had reached him concerning a degree of domestic friction within our home, and he wished to assure me of the profound affection the community held for me. He emphasized that the Ordnung was never intended to function as confinement. Rather, it was established as a protective barrier designed to shield the flock from external predators, not to imprison the sheep. He stated clearly that they had no desire to lose me, consumed his beverage, took a single portion of food, and instructed Jonas to exercise forbearance with me, using the exact phrasing a seasoned farmer might receive regarding a young animal requiring guidance. Turning his attention to me, he explained that personal willfulness functions as a gradual toxin, and the sole antidote is Gelassenheit, the total relinquishment of self-will and the submission of the individual ego. He assured me that a woman who successfully masters this yielding of self would discover that the relational chill leaves the home immediately, allowing emotional warmth to return. Following his departure, the garment remained untouched on its peg. I declined to wear it for the duration of that winter season, relying instead on my old outerwear with its repeatedly repaired sleeve. Each time I navigated past the new coat, the leader's admonitions seemed to embed themselves a bit deeper into the very flooring of our home. By the time March arrived, my vision had trained itself to bypass the new garment entirely, a psychological defense mechanism that occurs when an object becomes taboo. Your mind effectively draws a veil over the item, permitting you to walk past it for months without consciously registering its existence. When spring arrived, I found myself expecting another child. I will forgo detailing the entirety of that experience, as the realities of gestation within a community that views a woman's physical form primarily as collective operational property, where rest is treated with suspicion, expressions of physical distress are labeled as vanity, and the solitary approved reaction to utter exhaustion is unceasing labor, is an account requiring its own dedicated space. I will share only that the pregnancy terminated unsuccessfully at the conclusion of the 4th month. The loss occurred entirely in isolation within the upstairs sleeping quarters on a Tuesday in late June, while Jonas was working the distant southern acreage. I personally laundered the soiled bedding prior to his evening return, and my grief did not manifest in tears until 2 weeks had elapsed. When those tears finally came, I shed them in the darkness of the basement, pressing my face against the chilled wooden shelving holding our preserved goods, simply because the cellar represented the solitary location in the entire house where my voice could not be detected by others. I withheld this information from my mother, from Susanna, and from the spouse of the bishop, maintaining absolute silence on the matter for nearly a year. Through that experience, a core element of my identity that had spent 5 years bending, much like a pliable young tree adapting to an overwhelming gale it cannot openly resist, ultimately ceased its compliance. It did not shatter. For those looking for a moment of intense theatricality, there was no explosive break. The internal mechanism simply stopped yielding, and a profound stillness settled within me, mirroring the behavior of a creature that has finally comprehended the exact dimensions of its confinement. From that quiet place, I quietly and systematically began to organize a plan. The ultimate conclusion to depart did not manifest in the manner I had traditionally envisioned. During the quiet, illicit moments I spent contemplating escape over the preceding months, I anticipated that the break would resemble a violent tempest, a severe confrontation, a forcefully closed door, or a sudden dramatic awakening akin to the plots found in the scarce secular literature I had discovered during my youth. Instead, the realization materialized on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, while I was hanging freshly washed laundry. The clothesline stretched from the side exterior of our residence to the corner of the woodhouse, and I was arranging Jonas's shirts according to our rigid household custom, collars oriented toward the south, with the sleeves overlapping in a precise fashion. Gazing at the line of 8 white garments shifting subtly in the breeze, a sudden clarity struck me. I recognized that I had performed this identical task with the same 8 shirts in the exact same sequence for 7 consecutive years. I understood with absolute certainty that if I remained, I would continue executing that precise routine until my physical body lacked the strength to reach the wire. That comprised the entire epiphany. I completed the task at hand, went indoors, prepared our evening meal, and put Eli to sleep. Later, I lay awake in the darkness beside Jonas, listening to the rhythmic, undisturbed respiration of a man entirely oblivious to the reality that the woman resting within his immediate reach had, in the brief interval between handling the second and third shirts that morning, transformed into an absolute stranger. The certainty of my choice arrived in the quiet manner a season transitions, not accompanied by a dramatic atmospheric disturbance, but with a serene, undeniable awareness that the entire environment has fundamentally shifted, rendering a return to the previous state completely impossible. I will save the intricate logistics of my actual departure for another time, as it deserves a meticulous and careful rendering, but I can outline its basic structure. I packed a single piece of luggage and retrieved the coffee container from its hiding place behind the basement preserves. The contents had grown to nearly $80, accumulated through small savings over 3 years. At 5:30 on a Thursday morning in early November, I made my way to the communal telephone shack located at the entrance of our driveway and placed a call to Ellen, a Mennonite woman residing in town. She had once conveyed a message to me with intense discretion at a roadside produce stall, offering her phone number should I ever require transportation. I had committed those digits to memory for 2 years without ever committing them to paper. I took Eli with me, leaving the navy wool coat undisturbed on its wooden peg. I will not deny that the subsequent transition was fraught with hardship. It was. The years that followed have been accompanied by the persistent ache of numerous quiet sorrows, the correspondence I directed to my mother that was returned to me unopened, and the repeated telephone calls to my sister's neighbor that rang endlessly into an absolute void, where I could sense the listening silence on the other end. There was a specific occasion 2 years after my departure when I drove through Holmes County and observed my father in the lot of a local agricultural supply business. I watched him look directly at me and then look completely through me, as though my form were entirely transparent, treating me as if the child he had raised had ceased to exist. My own sisters actively crossed to the opposite side of the road if our paths happened to intersect in public spaces, and the specific sound of a terminating telephone receiver still echoes in my dreams. This is the true reality of Meidung, or shunning. It does not involve physical assault. Rather, it is the systematic deprivation of the very social atmosphere you have depended upon since birth. It is the experience of the very individuals who instructed you in the basics of life, pretending that your countenance is entirely unfamiliar to them. It required 4 years of searching before my path crossed with a therapist who occupied a modest office situated on the upper floor of a building located above a local bakery. Her workspace featured 3 potted plants arranged on the ledge, which she tended with immense care every Wednesday, and she possessed a habit of consistently misplacing